The crack of a Winchester rifle echoed across the Sonoran desert like thunder breaking against stone. James Cole Coleman pressed his weathered cheek against the stock, watching through iron sights as dust kicked up near his quarry's horse hooves. 200 yards ahead, Jesse Tucker's gang spurred their mounts harder, weaving between towering saguaro cacti that stood like ancient sentinels in the merciless Arizona sun. Cole worked the lever of his Model 1873 chambering another .44-40 cartridge. The brass gleamed hot in the afternoon light. He'd been tracking Tucker's outfit for 6 days across this godforsaken wasteland, living on jerky and brackish water, sleeping with one eye open in his Colt Peacemaker within arm's reach. The bounty on Tucker was worth $500, dead or alive. Cole preferred alive when possible, but Tucker had made that choice harder with each innocent family he'd terrorized from Tucson to Phoenix. At 33, Cole had already lived 3 lifetimes worth of violence. His hands, scarred from rope burns and knife fights, held the rifle steady despite the tremor that sometimes came in quiet moments. The tremor that reminded him of Elizabeth's last breath of little Tommy's fevered face before the Comanche raid took his wife and son 2 years ago, leaving him with nothing but the wind and the weight of memory. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of burnt orange and bone white painted with the deep purples of distant mountains. Heat waves danced above the hardpan like spirits of the dead. Cole's black gelding ranger snorted and shifted beneath him, muscles twitching with the need to run. The horse understood pursuit as well as his master. They'd ridden together through too many hunts to count from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. Cole squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against his shoulder, and Tucker's hat flew from his head like a startled bird. The message was clear: surrender or die. But Tucker and his 3 remaining men only rode harder, disappearing behind a ridge of red stone that looked like a sleeping giant's spine. Cole spurred Ranger forward, the big gelding's hooves finding purchase on loose shale and scattered barrel cactus. His Texas Ranger training kicked in automatically. Read the terrain, anticipate the escape route, never chase blind into an ambush. The lessons had been beaten into him during 5 hard years enforcing law in the Nueces Strip, where Mexican banditos and Comanche war parties turned every sunrise into a gamble with death. As he crested the ridge, Cole's blood went cold. Tucker's gang was nowhere in sight, but something else demanded his attention. From the south, not more than a mile away, the sharp crack of gunfire split the desert air. 3 distinct weapons, a heavy rifle, probably a Sharps buffalo gun, and 2 lighter reports that sounded like Colt revolvers. Between the shots carried on the desert wind came something that made Cole's gut twist with recognition. A woman's scream, high, desperate, and unmistakably terrified. Cole reined Ranger hard to the south. Tucker's bounty suddenly forgotten. In all his years of violence and bloodshed, from cavalry charges against Confederate lines to midnight raids on cattle rustlers, he'd never been able to ignore that particular sound. It cut through him like a bowie knife, sharp and cold, dragging up memories of Elizabeth calling his name, that terrible night when the war paint and eagle feathers came riding out of hell itself. The gelding's iron shoes rang against stone as they descended into a narrow wash bordered by ocotillo and prickly pear. Cole drew his Colt, checking the cylinder from habit. 5 rounds loaded hammer, resting on an empty chamber. The weight of the weapon in his hand felt natural as breathing. He'd carried various Colts since he was 17, from the cap and ball Navy model during the war to this newer Peacemaker that had never failed him when death came calling. Another scream echoed off the canyon walls closer, now followed by harsh male laughter that carried no humor, only cruelty. Cole's jaw tightened. Whatever was happening ahead, it wasn't a friendly encounter. He loosened his Winchester in its scabbard and checked his cartridge belt. 40 rounds for the rifle, 30 for the Colt, and his grandfather's Arkansas toothpick riding in its leather sheath at the small of his back. Enough firepower to discourage most forms of trouble, assuming trouble could be reasoned with at gunpoint. The wash curved left around a massive boulder that had tumbled from the rim eons ago. Cole dismounted, ground-tying Ranger with a soft command in Spanish, then crept forward on foot. His boots, worn thin from countless miles of hard country, made no sound on the sandy bottom of the arroyo. Through a gap in the stone, he could see movement ahead. 3 horses lathered and blowing. 3 men standing in a rough circle around something on the ground. Cole eased his hat off and peered through a crack in the boulder. What he saw made his trigger finger itch with violent intent. A woman lay pinned beneath an overturned travois, her dark hair spilling across the sand like spilled ink. Even from 30 yards away, Cole could see she was heavy with child, maybe 7 or 8 months along. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing brown skin that marked her as Indian, probably Apache given this part of Arizona territory. She struggled weakly against the wooden frame that trapped her legs, her movements growing more frantic as the three men closed in. The men were white dusty from hard travel and armed with the casual competence of those who made their living with violence. Cole recognized the type: bounty hunters, scalp hunters, or worse, the kind of men who'd shoot a sleeping camp for the silver in dead men's teeth. Their leader was a tall drink of water with a tobacco-stained beard and eyes like chips of winter sky. He carried a Sharps rifle with casual familiarity and wore his guns tied down low in the fashion of someone who'd had occasion to draw fast and shoot straight. "Last chance, squaw," the tall man was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Tell us where Cochise hid his gold, and we'll make this quick. Keep playing dumb, and we'll take our time with you before we carve that half-breed brat out of your belly." The woman's response came in rapid Apache words Cole didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. She'd rather die than tell them anything. Her voice carried the kind of dignity that couldn't be broken by threats or steel, the same quality Cole had seen in captured Confederate officers who'd choose death before dishonor. The tall man spat in the sand. "Stubborn as all your kind. Well, boys, looks like we do this the hard way. Miguel, get your skinning knife. Let's see how long she keeps that Apache pride when we start peeling strips off her." Cole had heard enough. He'd seen enough. Whatever this woman had done or hadn't done, whatever treasure these men thought she knew about, none of it justified what they were planning. Some lines couldn't be crossed, not by any man who wanted to look at himself in a shaving mirror afterward. He eased back from the boulder and considered his options. 3 against 1 weren't impossible odds, but they weren't comfortable either. The smart play would be to fire a warning shot, announce himself as a lawman, and hope they'd see reason. But Cole had learned in too many hard situations that reasonable men didn't torture pregnant women for information. These weren't the type to surrender just because someone showed them a badge. The Apache woman's voice rose again, this time speaking English with only a slight accent. "I know nothing of Cochise's gold. I am Ayanna Rivers. My husband was William Rivers, a trader from Tucson. He died of fever 6 months ago. I traveled to Tombstone to claim his property there." "Rivers," the tall man mused. "Hell, Miguel, remember that fancy-talking Englishman we robbed near Benson last spring? Had himself a pretty little Apache wife and a bag full of silver dollars." "See, I remember him," came the reply in accented English. "He begged like a woman before you put that bullet in his head." Cole's blood turned to ice water. These weren't just treasure hunters or bounty killers. They were the men who'd made Ayanna Rivers a widow. The men who'd murdered her husband and were now preparing to finish what they'd started. The mathematics of justice had suddenly become very simple. He checked his Colt one more time, then drew his Winchester from its scabbard. The rifle felt solid and familiar in his hands, and an old friend that had never let him down when the chips were scattered and the devil was dealing. Cole had learned long ago that sometimes the only thing standing between innocence and evil was one man willing to pull a trigger when pulling needed doing. Moving with the careful quiet of a hunter stalking prey, Cole worked his way around the boulder pile until he had a clear field of fire. The three men were still grouped around the trapped woman, their attention focused entirely on their victim. They'd made the classic mistake of men who'd grown too comfortable with easy prey. They'd forgotten to watch their backs. Cole centered the Winchester's front sight on the tall man's chest, then raised the barrel slightly. Even bushwhackers deserved a chance to surrender, though he didn't expect them to take it. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd given such orders before. "Step away from the woman and put your hands where I can see them." All three men spun toward the sound of his voice, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The tall man was fastest, his Colt clearing leather with practiced speed. He was good. Under different circumstances, he might have been good enough. Cole's Winchester spoke first. The heavy point, 4440 slug, took the tall man's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the sand. He was dead before he hit the ground, his unfired Colt flying from nerveless fingers. The other two men were already moving, diving for cover behind their horses and clawing for their guns. Cole worked the Winchester's lever, the spent brass cartridge spinning away in a golden arc. He put his second shot into Miguel's shoulder, the impact slamming the man against his horse's flank. The third man, a young fellow with scared rabbit eyes, got his pistol up and fired wild, the bullet whining off stone 10 feet from Cole's position. "Your choice," Cole called out, already sighting for his next shot. "Drop the iron and ride out or join your friend in the sand." Miguel was trying to bring his gun up with his good arm, blood streaming from his shoulder wound. Cole put him down with a shot that took him in the chest, the man folding like a bad poker hand. The young one looked at his dead partners, looked at the muzzle of Cole's rifle centered on his chest, and made the smart choice. His Colt hit the ground with a metallic thunk. "Please, mister," he stammered, hands reaching for the sky. "I didn't want no part of this. They made me ride with them. I was just holding their horses." "Then hold them a little longer," Cole replied, keeping the rifle trained on the man while he approached. "But first get that lady out from under that travois." The young man moved quickly to comply, lifting the wooden frame that had pinned Ayanna Rivers to the ground. She sat up slowly, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other pushing dark hair from her face. Cole got his first clear look at her and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been dead since Elizabeth's funeral. Ayanna Rivers was beautiful in the way that desert wildflowers were beautiful, hardy, proud, and touched with a wildness that civilization couldn't tame. Her face was oval-shaped with high cheekbones and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. She looked to be about 25, young enough to start over, but old enough to have learned hard lessons about the world's cruelty. The mixture of Apache and Mexican heritage showed in her features, creating something uniquely striking. But it was her bearing that impressed Cole most. Despite being pregnant, despite being trapped and threatened by killers, despite having just watched 3 men die violently, she maintained a dignity that spoke of inner strength. She reminded him of the Apache prisoners he'd sometimes seen during his ranger days, warriors who die before showing fear to their enemies. "Ma'am," Cole said, touching the brim of his hat, "are you hurt?" "My ankle," she replied, her English carrying only the faintest trace of accent. "I think it may be sprained, but the baby seems unharmed." She studied him with those dark eyes, taking in his dusty trail clothes, his weapons the easy way he held the Winchester. "You are not with them." "No, ma'am. Name's James Coleman. Folks call me Cole." He gestured toward the young man who still stood with his hands raised. "What do you want me to do with this one?" Ayanna looked at the surviving gunman, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Let him go, but not with his weapons or his horse. Let him walk back to wherever he came from and think about the choices that brought him here." Cole nodded. It was more mercy than the man deserved, but he'd learned to respect the judgment of those who'd been wronged. "You heard the lady. Start walking. If I see you again, I'll assume you're looking for trouble and act accordingly." The young man needed no further encouragement. He set off across the desert at a fast walk, glancing back nervously until he disappeared behind a ridge. Cole watched him go, then turned his attention to more pressing matters. "Can you ride?" he asked Ayanna. "This isn't a good place to linger. Those gunshots will carry for miles, and there's no telling who might come to investigate." "I can ride," she said, accepting his hand to help her stand. She tested her weight on the injured ankle, wincing slightly but staying upright. "My horse bolted when the shooting started, but she won't have gone far. She's trained to come when I whistle." True to her word, a sharp whistle brought a paint mare trotting back from behind a stand of ocotillo. The horse was a fine-looking animal, well cared for and clearly intelligent. Cole helped Ayanna into her saddle, noting the easy way she settled into the seat. She rode like someone born to it, which fit with what he knew of Apache women. "Where were you headed when this happened?" Cole asked Mounting Ranger. "Tombstone," she replied, adjusting her torn dress as modestly as possible. "My husband left me property there, a building on Allen Street that was supposed to become a dressmaking shop." Her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Though I've never seen it. William handled all the business matters." Cole frowned. In his experience, men who kept their wives ignorant of business matters usually had good reasons for doing so, and those reasons rarely worked out well for the widows. "You have papers, deed will something legal, in my saddlebags." She patted a leather pouch tied behind her saddle. William was very careful about documentation. He said the law was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Her husband had been right about that, Cole reflected. He'd seen enough of chaos to appreciate civilization, even the rough-hewn variety they practiced out here in the territories. Well, let's get you to Tombstone then. See what your husband left you. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, Cole keeping watch for signs of pursuit, while Ayanna seemed lost in private thoughts. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But beauty was a luxury Cole rarely allowed himself to notice anymore. Beauty led to attachment, and attachment led to loss, and he'd had his fill of loss. "Why did you help me?" Ayanna asked suddenly, her voice breaking the desert quiet. Cole considered the question for a long moment. Why had he abandoned Tucker's trail to help a stranger? The practical answer was that he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people be hurt. The deeper answer touched places in his soul that he preferred to keep locked away. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. "Those men murdered your husband. They were fixing to murder you and your child. Sometimes there's no mystery to it. Sometimes right and wrong are as clear as black and white. Not everyone would see it that way. Not everyone would risk their lives for a stranger, especially an Apache stranger." The weight of that observation settled between them like dust after a windstorm. Cole had seen enough of frontier prejudice to know she was right. Apache raids had terrorized Arizona territory for decades, and most white settlers made no distinction between hostile warriors and peaceful families. An Apache woman traveling alone would be considered fair game by many men who thought themselves decent. "I've known good people and bad people of every color," Cole said. "A man's character isn't written in his skin, it's written in his actions." That's unusually enlightened thinking for, she paused, seeming to search for the right words, for a rough-looking cowboy who shoots people for a living. Cole's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Ma'am, I've been a lot of things in my 33 years. Soldier, lawman, scout, and yes, sometimes a killer when killing needed doing. But I've never been the kind of man who hurts women and children." As they rode deeper into the afternoon, Ayanna began to tell him about her life. She was the daughter of a Mexican trader and an Apache woman from Cochise's band, raised between two worlds and fully accepted by neither. Her education had come from mission schools and her mother's traditional teachings, creating a unique perspective that allowed her to navigate both cultures with equal skill. "I met William in Tucson 3 years ago," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of fondness and sadness. "He was buying turquoise and silver jewelry to sell in the eastern cities. He said I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and that my craftsmanship with beadwork and leatherwork was extraordinary." "Sounds like a man who knew quality when he saw it," Cole observed. "He was kind to me, respectful. He never tried to change who I was or make me ashamed of my Apache blood. When he asked me to marry him, it seemed like a gift from the spirits, a chance for happiness and security I'd never expected to find." The pain in her voice told Cole how that story had ended. William Rivers might have been a good husband, but fever and frontier disease didn't respect good intentions. Too many graves in every cemetery bore witness to lives cut short by circumstances beyond human control. "How long since he passed?" Cole asked gently. 6 months. The fever came fast and there was nothing the doctor could do. One day he was making plans for our future, and 3 days later I was digging his grave. She rested one hand on her swollen belly. He never got to see our child. They crested a ridge and saw tombstones spread out in the valley below, a sprawling collection of wooden buildings and canvas tents that had grown up around the silver mines like mushrooms after rain. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and even at this distance, they could hear the sounds of a boomtown in full swing, hammering, shouting the screech of wagon wheels, and the occasional gunshot that might have been celebration or murder. "There it is," Cole said. "Tombstone. Hell's half-acre with a post office." "It's bigger than I expected," Ayanna murmured, studying the town with careful eyes. "William said it was growing fast, but this silver does that to a place, draws folks like flies to honey, and not all of them are the kind you'd invite to Sunday dinner." Cole pointed toward the main street where afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch between the buildings. "That's Allen Street, where most of the businesses are. If your husband left you property there, it'll be valuable. Prime real estate in a boomtown is worth its weight in silver. As they rode down into the valley, Cole found himself studying Ayanna from the corner of his eye. There was something about her that stirred feelings he'd thought buried forever. Maybe it was her courage in the face of danger, or the way she'd shown mercy to the man who had helped threaten her. Maybe it was simply that she was warm and human in a world that had seemed cold and empty for too long. Whatever it was, it scared him. Cole had learned to live with loneliness because loneliness was safe. It couldn't be taken away by Comanche raiders or wasting fever. It couldn't die in your arms while you begged God for just one more day. Loneliness was reliable in a way that love could never be. They entered Tombstone as the sun touched the western mountains, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. The town was every bit as rough as Cole had expected. Saloons outnumbered churches 10 to 1. The streets were ankle-deep in dust and horse droppings, and the sidewalks were crowded with miners, gamblers, cowboys, and working girls displaying their wares. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset, where a fast gun was worth more than a law degree. "We'll need to find you a room first," Cole said, guiding Ranger around a freight wagon loaded with mining equipment. "Then we can locate your property and see about getting those papers looked at by someone official." "I have very little money," Ayanna admitted. "William's medical bills took most of our savings, and what little remained went for supplies for this journey. Don't worry about that right now. We'll figure something out." Cole knew he was making promises he might not be able to keep, but something about this woman's situation brought out protective instincts he'd thought were dead and buried. Maybe it was her pregnancy that reminded him of Elizabeth, or maybe it was simply that he'd grown tired of standing by while the world ground decent people into dust. They found a modest boarding house on Fremont Street run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, who looked like she could stare down a charging bull. She examined Ayanna with sharp eyes, taking in the torn dress, the Apache features, and the obvious pregnancy. "We don't usually take in Indian women," she said bluntly. "Causes trouble with some of the other guests. This lady is recently widowed and in need of respectable lodging." Cole said, his voice carrying a quiet edge that suggested argument would be unwise. "She can pay her way, and she won't cause any trouble." Mrs. Patterson looked between Cole and Ayanna, clearly weighing the potential for problems against the prospect of paying customers. In a boomtown, money usually won such arguments. $3 a week, meals included. Payment in advance. No visitors in the rooms, no drinking, and no noise after 10 o'clock. "That's acceptable," Ayanna said, reaching for her saddlebags. She counted out silver coins, leaving Cole to wonder how much she actually had left after paying for a week's lodging. With Ayanna settled, Cole accompanied her to the Cochise County Courthouse to examine the property records. The clerk, a nervous little man named Whitman, seemed more interested in studying Ayanna's appearance than helping with their request. It took a few pointed questions from Cole to get the man focused on the business at hand. "Rivers, William Rivers," Whitman muttered, thumbing through a thick ledger. "Here it is, lot 47 on Allen Street, purchased 6 months ago. Building described as," he squinted at the handwriting, "two-story frame construction, first floor, suitable for commercial use, second floor residential. Purchased from the Tombstone Development Company for $800. $800 was a considerable sum, enough to buy a small ranch in most parts of the territory. If the building was as described, Ayanna had inherited something valuable indeed. But Cole's lawman instincts were sending up warning signals. In his experience, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "We'd like to see the property," he said to Whitman, "and we'd like copies of all the relevant papers." "That'll be 50 cents for the copies," Whitman replied, already beginning to write. "And you'll want to talk to Mr. Blackwell about the property. He's the local representative for the development company, handles all their business in Tombstone." Cole felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up at the mention of that name. Harrison Blackwell. He'd heard it before in connection with several questionable land deals throughout the territory. Nothing provably illegal, but enough smoke to suggest fire. "Where might we find Mr. Blackwell?" Cole asked, keeping his voice casual. "He has an office above the Crystal Palace Saloon. Usually there most afternoons conducting business." Whitman handed over the copied papers and collected his fee. "Fine gentleman, Mr. Blackwell. Harvard educated, they say. Not many men of his caliber out here in the territories." Cole thanked the clerk and escorted Ayanna back onto Allen Street. The afternoon was wearing on toward evening, and the town was beginning to show its nighttime face. Music drifted from the saloons accompanied by laughter and the occasional curse. Cowboys fresh from the ranges were looking to spend their wages on whiskey and companionship, while miners covered in silver dust sought similar diversions. There, Ayana said suddenly, pointing toward a two-story building squeezed between a barbershop and a gun store. That must be it. Lot 47. Cole studied the building with a practiced eye. It was well constructed with large windows on the ground floor that would be perfect for displaying merchandise. The upper floor showed signs of recent renovation with fresh paint and new window glass. It should have been a perfect inheritance for a young widow looking to start a business. But something was wrong. Cole couldn't put his finger on it, but 33 years of hard living had taught him to trust his instincts. Those instincts were screaming that this situation was more complicated than it appeared. It's beautiful. Ayana breathed, her hand resting on her belly. William chose well. This could be a wonderful place to raise a child and build a business. Before Cole could respond, a cultured voice spoke behind them. Mrs. Rivers, I presume. They turned to see a man approaching from the direction of the Crystal Palace. Harrison Blackwell was everything the courthouse clerk had suggested, tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence that came from education and breeding. He wore a dark suit that had cost more than most men earned in a month, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the dusty streets. But Cole's attention was drawn to other details. The slight bulge under Blackwell's left arm that suggested a shoulder holster. The way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, never focusing on one spot for too long. The calluses on his hands that spoke of familiarity with firearms despite his gentleman's appearance. I am Harrison Blackwell. The man continued, extending a manicured hand toward Ayana. I represent the Tombstone Development Company. I've been expecting you since we received word of your dear husband's passing. Please accept my condolences on your loss. Thank you, Ayana replied, though Cole noticed she didn't take the offered hand. I've come to claim the property William purchased. Yes, of course, though I'm afraid there have been some developments that complicate the situation. Blackwell's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Perhaps we could discuss this in my office. I'm sure we can reach an arrangement that serves everyone's interests. Cole stepped slightly closer to Ayana, his hand dropping casually to rest near his Colt. What kind of developments? Blackwell's gaze shifted to Cole, taking in everything from his worn trail clothes to the tied-down holster at his hip. I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Coleman, James Coleman. Ah, yes, the bounty hunter. Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Coleman. Blackwell's tone suggested he found Cole's profession distasteful but potentially useful. I assume Mrs. Rivers has retained your services for protection during her journey. Something like that, Cole replied, neither confirming nor denying the assumption. He was beginning to dislike Harrison Blackwell intensely, though he couldn't yet put his finger on exactly when. Well then, perhaps you'd both care to join me for dinner this evening. We can discuss Mrs. Rivers' situation in comfort away from the dust and noise of the street. Blackwell gestured toward the Crystal Palace. I know a quiet restaurant where we can speak privately. Cole was about to decline when Ayana surprised him by accepting. That would be very kind, Mr. Blackwell. Shall we say 7 o'clock? Excellent. I'll make the arrangements. Blackwell tipped his hat and walked away, but not before Cole caught him glancing back once with an expression that might have been calculated in. Why did you agree to that? Cole asked when they were alone. Because I want to know what these developments are that complicate my situation, and because it's better to face trouble head-on than to let it sneak up behind you. Ayana's voice carried a note of steel that reminded Cole she was Apache, as well as Mexican, raised in a culture that valued courage above comfort. That evening, they met Blackwell at Delmonico's restaurant, one of Tombstone's more respectable establishments. The man had chosen well. The dining room was quiet and private, with white tablecloths and actual china plates. Cole felt underdressed in his trail clothes, but Ayana had somehow managed to repair her torn dress and arrange her hair in a way that made her look elegant despite their rough circumstances. Blackwell was already seated when they arrived, studying some papers spread on the table before him. He rose when he saw Ayana displaying the kind of old-world courtesy that was rare in frontier towns. Mrs. Rivers, you look lovely this evening. Mr. Coleman. They ordered dinner, making small talk while they waited for the food to arrive. Blackwell proved to be an educated conversationalist, discussing everything from the political situation in Washington to the latest developments in mining technology. But Cole noticed that his eyes kept returning to Ayanna with an intensity that had nothing to do with casual interest. "Now then," Blackwell said when the plates were cleared away, "let's discuss your unfortunate situation, Mrs. Rivers. I'm afraid I have some rather disturbing news regarding the property your husband purchased." He spread out a series of official-looking documents pointing to various seals and signatures. "These are surveys conducted by the territorial government in preparation for the Southern Pacific Railroad's expansion through this area. As you can see, the proposed route runs directly through the heart of Tombstone, including Allen Street." Cole leaned forward to examine the papers, though he was careful not to touch them. The documents looked authentic enough with the proper governmental seals and signatures, but something about them bothered him, some detail that didn't quite ring true. "What does this mean for my property?" Ayanna asked, her voice steady despite the obvious implications. "I'm afraid it means the federal government will exercise its right of eminent domain to seize the land for public use. Oh, there will be compensation, of course, but it will be based on the property's value before the railroad announcement, which is considerably less than current market rates." Blackwell paused, letting the implications sink in. "However, the Tombstone Development Company is prepared to make you a generous offer for your property. We'll pay current market value in cash, and you can be on your way before the government bureaucrats arrive with their seizure orders." "How generous?" Cole asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. $200 in gold, payable immediately upon signing the transfer documents. $200 for property that was worth at least 4 times that amount, and probably more given Tombstone's rapid growth. It was legal theft wrapped in fancy language in government authority. "That's quite a reduction from the $800 my husband paid," Ayanna observed, her voice carefully neutral. "Unfortunately, the railroad situation has changed everything. I'm trying to help you recover what you can before you lose everything to government seizure." Blackwell's tone was sympathetic, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Of course the decision is entirely yours, but I'd hate to see you end up with nothing." Cole had heard enough. Every instinct developed through years of law enforcement was telling him that Harrison Blackwell was running some kind of confidence game. The question was whether he could prove it before Ayanna made a decision she'd regret. "We'll need time to consider your offer," Cole said, standing from the table. "Mrs. Rivers has been through a great deal lately. She shouldn't make important financial decisions without proper rest and reflection." "Of course," Blackwell agreed, though his smile tightened slightly. "Take all the time you need, though I should mention that the development company's offer may not remain open indefinitely. Market conditions change rapidly in boomtowns." They parted company outside the restaurant, Blackwell heading back toward the Crystal Palace, while Cole escorted Ayanna to her boarding house. The streets were alive with the sounds of a frontier town's nightlife, piano music from the saloons, laughter from the gambling halls, and the occasional gunshot that might have been celebration or violence. "He's lying," Ayanna said suddenly as they walked along Fremont Street. "What makes you say that?" "The same thing that makes you suspicious of him. William taught me to read people, to look for the signs of deception in business dealings. Mr. Blackwell has all the signs." Cole felt a surge of respect for this remarkable woman. Despite her youth and recent loss, she possessed the kind of practical intelligence that came from surviving in a hard world. "The question is what he's lying about and why, and what we're going to do about it." That night, Cole took a room at a different boarding house, one that gave him a clear view of Ayanna's lodging and most of Allen Street. He sat by the window, Winchester across his knees, watching for any sign of trouble. Tombstone's nighttime activities continued until well past midnight, but nothing seemed directly threatening. It was nearly 3 in the morning when he saw them, 2 figures moving carefully through the shadows toward Ayanna's boarding house. They moved like men accustomed to violence, checking corners and doorways with practiced caution. Cole recognized the type hired guns, the kind of men who'd kill for money and sleep soundly afterward. He grabbed his rifle and made his way quietly down to the street, circling around behind the 2 intruders. They were examining the lock on the boarding house's side door, one of them working with what looked like a set of picks while the other kept watch. "Looking for something, boys?" Cole asked softly, pressing the Winchester's muzzle against the first man's neck. Both men froze their hands, moving instinctively toward their weapons before common sense prevailed. Cole was behind them with a rifle, and they were silhouetted against the pale wood of the door. It would be suicide to try for their guns. "Easy, mister," the lookout said, his voice tight with fear. "We ain't looking for trouble." "Then what are you looking for? And don't tell me you're just out for a midnight stroll." "I've been doing this too long to believe fairy tales." "We was told to look for some papers," the lockpick admitted. "Legal documents. Nothing valuable, just papers." "Told by who?" The men exchanged glances, clearly weighing the risks of talking against the risks of remaining silent. The rifle muzzle against one man's neck helped tip the scales. "Mr. Blackwell, he said the Indian woman had some documents that rightfully belonged to his company. Said we should retrieve them quiet-like, without disturbing anyone." Cole felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. Blackwell wasn't just trying to buy Ayana's property cheap. He was desperate to get his hands on her legal documents, which suggested that those documents contained something that contradicted his claims about the railroad in eminent domain. "Here's what's going to happen," Cole said quietly. "You're going to walk away from here and keep walking until you're out of Tombstone. If I see either of you again, I'll assume you're looking for trouble and act accordingly." The men needed no further encouragement. They disappeared into the shadows with remarkable speed, leaving Cole alone with his thoughts and suspicions. Whatever game Harrison Blackwell was playing, it was more serious than a simple land swindle. Men didn't hire burglars to steal worthless papers. The next morning brought news that confirmed Cole's worst suspicions. Ayana found him at breakfast in the hotel dining room, her face pale but determined. "Someone searched my room last night," she said without preamble. "They were very careful, very quiet, but I'm a light sleeper. Years of living in Apache country teach you to wake at the smallest sound." "Did they find what they were looking for?" "No, I keep all my important papers with me at all times." She patted a leather pouch hanging from her shoulder. "William taught me never to trust important documents to hotel rooms or boarding houses." Cole nodded approvingly. Smart woman married to a smart man. "What exactly is in those papers that has Blackwell so interested?" Ayana glanced around the dining room, making sure they weren't being overheard. "I'm not entirely sure. William handled all the legal matters, and much of it is in language I don't fully understand. But there are surveys, deeds, correspondence with government officials. Perhaps someone with legal knowledge could explain their significance. We need to find a lawyer, someone who's not connected to Blackwell or his development company. Is there such a person in Tombstone?" Cole considered the question. In a boomtown like Tombstone, most lawyers were either corrupt, incompetent, or both. But there had to be someone honest enough to examine Ayana's documents without immediately selling the information to the highest bidder. "Maybe. There's a man named Joshua Thompson, used to be a territorial judge before he retired and moved here to practice medicine. If anyone can interpret legal documents honestly, it would be him." They found Dr. Thompson in his office on 4th Street, a small building that served as both medical practice and unofficial legal consultation service. Thompson was a man in his 60s, white-haired and dignified, with the kind of steady hands and sharp eyes that inspired confidence in both patients and clients. "Mrs. Rivers," he said after Cole had made introductions and explained their situation. "I knew your husband slightly. He struck me as an honest businessman, which is unfortunately rare in these parts. Please let me examine these documents." Thompson spread Ayana's papers across his desk, studying them with the careful attention of a man trained in both law and medicine. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave. "This is most interesting," he said finally, "and most disturbing. According to these documents, there is no railroad plan through Tombstone. The surveys Mr. Blackwell showed you are forgeries, very good ones, but forgeries nonetheless." Cole felt anger building in his chest like steam in a boiler. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely. I maintain correspondence with territorial officials in Phoenix and Washington. The Southern Pacific's expansion plans call for a route 50 miles south of here through Benson and on to El Paso. There's been no change to those plans and certainly no eminent domain proceedings for Tombstone property." Ayana's hands clenched into fists. "So, Blackwell is trying to steal my property by lying about government seizure." "It appears so, but the situation is even worse than simple fraud." Thompson picked up one of the documents, a letter bearing official seals. "This correspondence suggests that Mr. Blackwell has been conducting similar schemes throughout Arizona Territory. He identifies properties owned by widows, minorities, or other vulnerable individuals, then uses forged documents to frighten them into selling at drastically reduced prices. How many people has he cheated? Cole asked. Based on these references, at least a dozen families, possibly more. The total value of the stolen property could exceed $50,000. Cole whistled low. $50,000 was enough money to buy a county judgeship or a territorial legislative seat. It was the kind of money that corrupted everything it touched. What can we do about it? Ayanna asked. We need to contact the territorial authorities in Phoenix, present them with this evidence. But that could take weeks, and there's no guarantee they'll act quickly. Men like Blackwell often have friends in high places. Cole stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy streets of Tombstone. Somewhere out there, Harrison Blackwell was continuing his schemes, cheating honest people out of their life savings and property. The law might eventually catch up with him, but how many more families would be destroyed in the meantime? There might be another way, he said slowly, but it would be dangerous, and there's no guarantee it would work. Tell me, Ayanna said simply. Cole turned back to face them, his decision made. We expose him publicly, force him to defend his claims in front of the whole town. If we can prove he's been using forged documents, his credibility will be destroyed. No one will trust him to buy so much as a drink, let alone valuable property. Dr. Thompson frowned. That's a risky strategy. If Blackwell has been operating on this scale, he must have significant resources. He won't hesitate to use violence to protect his schemes. I'm counting on it, Cole replied grimly. Men like Blackwell are dangerous as long as they can operate in the shadows. Force them into the light, and they usually make mistakes. As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the office door. Dr. Thompson opened it to reveal a young Mexican boy holding an envelope. For the señora, the boy said, pointing at Ayanna. The man he saved, very important. Ayanna opened the envelope and read the message inside, her face growing pale. She handed it to Cole without a word. The note was brief and to the point. Mrs. Rivers, your circumstances have changed. Meet me at the Crystal Palace at 8 this evening to discuss your final offer. Come alone, H. Blackwell. He knows we've been investigating him, Cole said. This is his way of forcing a confrontation. Then we'll give him one, Ayanna replied, steel in her voice. But not on his terms. Cole looked at this remarkable woman, pregnant and recently widowed, facing down a dangerous criminal with the courage of a seasoned warrior. In that moment, he knew that whatever happened next, he would stand with her against whatever Harrison Blackwell could bring to bear. The Crystal Palace Saloon stood like a monument to vice and ambition in the heart of Tombstone's entertainment district. Its painted facade gleamed even in the morning sun, advertising games of chance and feminine companionship to anyone with silver dollars burning holes in their pockets. Cole studied the building from across Allen Street, noting the second-story windows that would give Harrison Blackwell a commanding view of anyone approaching his office. He chose his location well, Cole murmured to Ayanna, who stood beside him dressed in the best clothes she could manage. The torn dress had been mended with careful stitches that spoke of Apache training and making things last. High ground, multiple escape routes, and enough noise from downstairs to cover the sound of unpleasant conversations. My grandfather always said that a man's choice of ground reveals his intentions. Ayanna replied, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Mr. Blackwell has chosen the ground of a predator. They weren't alone in their surveillance. Dr. Thompson had arrived early, carrying his medical bag as if making house calls. He'd positioned himself outside the barbershop, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but actually watching for any unusual activity around the Crystal Palace. The good doctor had proven surprisingly willing to involve himself in what could become a violent confrontation. 40 years of practicing medicine on the frontier teaches a man that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, he'd explained the night before when they'd finalized their plan. I've seen too many good people destroyed by men like Blackwell. If we can stop him, we have a moral obligation to try. Cole checked his pocket watch, 11:30 in the morning. In 8.5 hours, he and Ayanna would walk into what might very well be a trap. But first they needed to gather more evidence, and if possible, find allies among Tombstone's citizens who'd been victimized by Blackwell's schemes. Their first stop was the home of Maria Gonzalez, a widow whose husband had been killed in a mining accident 6 months earlier. According to Dr. Thompson's information, she'd sold her small ranch to the Tombstone Development Company for a fraction of its value after being told the government was seizing the land for military purposes. They found Maria hanging laundry behind her modest adobe house, her 3 young children playing in the dusty yard. She was a small woman, probably not yet 30, but hard work and grief had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. When Cole explained why they'd come, her face grew hard with remembered anger. "See, I remember Senor Blackwell," she said, speaking English with a heavy accent. "He came to my house with papers, official papers with seals. He said the army needed my land for a fort that if I did not sell to him, the soldiers would take it anyway, and I would get nothing." "Did you ever see any soldiers?" Ayana asked gently. "No, never. But Senor Blackwell, he was so, how you say, convincing. He wore a fine suit, spoke like an educated man. He showed me the papers, pointed to the seals and signatures. I could not read them, but they looked real." Cole felt his anger building again. Maria Gonzalez was exactly the kind of victim predators like Blackwell sought out, isolated, vulnerable, unable to fight back against legal-sounding threats. "How much did he pay you?" $50 for land my husband paid 300 for. Her voice cracked slightly. "I knew it was not right, but I was afraid. Afraid of the soldiers, afraid of being left with nothing." "The soldiers were never coming," Ayana said softly. "Mr. Blackwell lied to you. There was never any military fort planned for this area." Maria's hands clenched into fists, laundry forgotten. "Hijo de perra, I should have known. My Jose, he always said never trust a man in a suit who comes knocking at sunset." And they spent another hour with Maria documenting her story and examining the forged documents Blackwell had left with her. Like the railroad papers he'd shown Ayana, they bore impressive seals in official-sounding language, but close examination revealed subtle inconsistencies that marked them as clever forgeries. "Would you be willing to speak publicly about what happened to you?" Cole asked as they prepared to leave. "See if it will stop him from hurting other families." "But Senor Coleman," she grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Be careful. Senor Blackwell, he has dangerous friends, men who carry guns and ask no questions." Their next stop was the modest frame house where Tom and Ellen Morrison lived with their 2 teenage sons. Tom had lost his left arm in a mine collapse the previous year, and the family had been struggling to make ends meet when Blackwell approached them about selling their small plot of land on the outskirts of town. He said the territorial government was building a new road right through our property. Tom explained, his remaining hand gesturing toward the empty fields behind his house. Said we could sell to his company for $200 or wait for the government to seize it through eminent domain and get maybe 50. We needed the money, Ellen added quietly. Tom couldn't work the mines anymore, and I was taking in washing, but it wasn't enough. $200 seemed like a fortune. Cole surveyed the property through the window. It was good land, well-watered and close enough to town to be valuable for development. In a boom town like Tombstone, it should have been worth at least $1,000. "Have you seen any signs of road construction?" Iana asked. "Nothing," Tom said bitterly, "and it's been 4 months since we signed the papers. I've been asking around and nobody at the territorial office knows anything about a road project through here." The pattern was becoming clear. Blackwell identified vulnerable property owners, then used forged government documents to create artificial urgency and drive down prices. It was a sophisticated confidence game that preyed on people's fear of bureaucratic authority and their unfamiliarity with legal procedures. By afternoon, they'd spoken with 8 families who'd been victimized by similar schemes. The total value of the stolen property exceeded $60,000, making Blackwell one of the most successful criminals in Arizona territory. But success had also made him careless, and carelessness would be his downfall. "We have enough evidence to convict him in any honest court," Dr. Thompson observed as they reviewed their findings in his office. "The question is whether we can survive long enough to present it to the authorities." "He's not going to give us that opportunity," Cole replied, checking his Colt for the dozenth time that day. "Men like Blackwell don't surrender quietly. When he realizes we're onto him, he'll try to eliminate the threat permanently." "Then why are we walking into his trap tonight?" Ayana asked. "Because sometimes the only way to catch a snake is to let it think it's cornered its prey." Cole's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd made similar calculations many times before. "Blackwell expects us to come alone and scared, ready to accept whatever terms he offers. Instead, we're going to give him more than he bargained for." As evening approached, Cole made his final preparations. He cleaned and loaded his Winchester, checked his ammunition supply, and tucked his grandfather's Arkansas toothpick into its sheath at the small of his back. The knife had saved his life twice during his Ranger days, and he had a feeling it might be needed again before this night was over. Dr. Thompson had recruited 2 allies from among Blackwell's victims. Tom Morrison, whose missing arm hadn't diminished his skill with a rifle, and a grizzled prospector named Pete Hawkins, who'd lost his claim to another of Blackwell's fraudulent schemes. Both men were armed and angry, ready to see justice done, even if it meant risking their lives. "Remember," Cole told the group as they gathered in the deepening shadows behind the Crystal Palace, "we want Blackwell alive if possible. A dead man can't return stolen property or testify against his accomplices. But if shooting starts, don't hesitate to defend yourselves." Ayanna checked the small derringer Cole had given her, concealing it in the folds of her dress. "I still think I should stay behind. A pregnant woman has no business in a gunfight." "A pregnant woman has everything to lose if we fail," Cole replied. "Besides, Blackwell requested this meeting with you specifically. If you don't show up, he'll smell a trap and disappear into the night. We might never get another chance at him." But before they could enter the Crystal Palace, Ayanna suddenly doubled over in pain, her hands clutching her swollen belly. "The baby," she gasped. "Something's wrong." Dr. Thompson was at her side immediately, his experienced hands checking for signs of premature labor. "It's stress-induced contractions," he said after a tense examination. "The baby's not coming yet, but you need rest and quiet. This confrontation will have to wait." "No," Ayanna said through gritted teeth. "If we don't face Blackwell tonight, he'll know we're on to him. He'll disappear, and all those families will never get their property back." Before anyone could argue, the decision was taken out of their hands. 8 armed men emerged from the Crystal Palace, spreading out to surround their position. At their head walked Harrison Blackwell, no longer the cultured gentleman, but revealed as what he'd always been, a predator in expensive clothes. "Mr. Coleman, Mrs. Rivers," he called out pleasantly. "How considerate of you to bring friends to our little meeting, though I'm afraid the guest list has grown rather larger than anticipated." Behind Blackwell's men, more figures appeared: territorial officials, federal marshals, and at their head, a tall man with steel-gray hair whose badge gleamed in the lamplight. "Marshal Samuel Crawford, United States Marshal Service," the man announced. "Harrison Blackwell, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal land laws." Cole felt the world shift beneath his feet. Either they were about to be rescued by legitimate law enforcement, or they'd walked into an even more elaborate trap than they'd imagined. "I'm afraid there's been some mistake, Marshal," Blackwell said smoothly. "I'm Agent Harrison Blackwell, conducting an undercover investigation for the Marshal Service. These people have been interfering with a federal operation." Crawford studied the scene with the careful eye of a man who'd seen enough corruption to recognize it in all its forms. "Agent Blackwell was indeed conducting an investigation," he said slowly. "The question is whether he was investigating crimes or committing them." Over the next hour, the truth slowly emerged. Blackwell had been a legitimate federal agent assigned to investigate territorial land fraud. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided the opportunities for profit were too good to pass up. Using his federal credentials as cover, he'd built an empire of corruption that stretched across 3 territories. "The photographs in his office tell the real story," Crawford explained as Blackwell was led away in chains. 7 Apache families murdered to cover up his illegal mining operations on tribal lands. Dozens of families defrauded of their property. This man wasn't just a criminal, he was a monster. With Blackwell's arrest, the immediate danger was over. But Ayanna's contractions were getting stronger, and it was clear the baby wasn't going to wait for a more convenient time. Dr. Thompson quickly arranged for her to be moved to his clinic, while Cole found himself caught between his desire to stay with her and his duty to help Marshal Crawford sort through the evidence of Blackwell's crimes. "Go to her," Crawford said, recognizing the conflict in Cole's eyes. "The paperwork can wait. A woman in labor needs someone she trusts." Cole arrived at Thompson's clinic just as Ayanna's labor began in earnest. For the next 8 hours, he paced the small waiting room, while the doctor and his assistant worked to bring new life into the world. The sounds that came from the delivery room ranged from encouraging to absolutely terrifying. And Cole found himself making bargains with a gun he wasn't sure he still believed in. When it was finally over, Thompson emerged with a bundle wrapped in soft blankets and an expression of pure joy. "Congratulations, Mr. Coleman. You have a daughter." Cole took the baby with trembling hands, looking down into a perfect face that seemed to combine the best features of both parents. She had Ayana's dark hair and his own blue eyes, and when she looked up at him, he felt his heart expand to accommodate more love than he thought possible. "Hello, Hope Elizabeth Coleman," he whispered. "Welcome to the world." Ayana was exhausted but radiant when he brought the baby to her. Despite everything they'd been through, despite the danger and uncertainty of the past weeks, she'd never looked more beautiful. "She's perfect," Ayana breathed, cradling their daughter against her chest. "William would have loved her." "I love her," Cole said simply, "and I love you. Ayana Rivers, will you marry me? Will you let us be a real family?" "Yes," she said with awe and hesitation, "to all of it." They were married 3 weeks later in Tombstone's small Catholic church, with Dr. Thompson officiating in his capacity as territorial judge. Marshall Crawford stood as Cole's best man, while Maria Gonzalez and Ellen Morrison served as Ayana's attendants. The church was packed with every family they'd helped during the fight against Blackwell's corruption, people who'd found justice and hope through their courage. Crawford had offered Cole a permanent position as a federal marshal with assignment to Arizona Territory as a roving investigator responsible for territorial crimes and corruption. It was meaningful work that would let him make a difference while providing security for his new family. "The territory needs good men," Crawford had explained. "Men who can't be bought or intimidated. Men who understand that justice isn't just about following the law, but about protecting the innocent from those who'd exploit them." Ayana's tailoring business flourished once her property was legally secured. The building on Allen Street became not just a shop, but a symbol of what honest people could accomplish when they stood together against corruption. She served customers from across the territory, creating beautiful clothing, while also serving as a bridge between the Apache and white communities. As the months passed, Cole found himself settling into a life he'd never thought possible after Elizabeth's death. There were still dangers, still corrupt men who needed facing down, but now he had something more than just duty driving him. He had love, family, and a future worth fighting for. On quiet evenings when the desert wind whispered through the streets of Tombstone and the silver mines had shut down for the night, Cole would sit on his porch and watch his family. Ayana would be teaching Hope some gentle song in Apache while dinner cooked on the stove, their voices mixing with the everyday sounds of a town that had learned to be more than just another mining camp. Hope Elizabeth Coleman grew into a bright, curious child who spoke Apache Spanish and English with equal fluency. She learned to ride and shoot from her father, to sew and bead from her mother, and to read and write from Dr. Thompson, who'd appointed himself her unofficial grandfather. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Cole found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them together. A chance encounter on a dangerous trail had changed both their lives, leading them through violence and loss to something better than either had dared to dream. The frontier was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year, but some things remained constant: the need for good people to stand against corruption, the importance of family and community, and the possibility that even the most damaged souls could find redemption through love and courage. Cole Coleman had spent his youth as a soldier and his early manhood as a Texas Ranger, but he would spend the rest of his life as a husband and father, protecting the family that had saved him from the darkness that had threatened to consume him. As he watched Hope take her first unsteady steps across the porch, reaching for her mother's outstretched arms, he knew that this was exactly where he belonged. The desert had taught them all that survival required more than just strength and weapons. It required the courage to hope, to love, and to build something beautiful from the harsh materials of an unforgiving world. And as the stars came out over Tombstone, bright and eternal in the clear mountain air, Cole Coleman held his wife and daughter close and gave thanks for the chance encounters and dangerous choices that had led him home.